Those that went out avidly into the sun had the lowest all-cause mortality, lowest cardiovascular mortality, and had the lowest cancer mortality and non-cardiovascular, non-cancer mortality. Chemicals that are scrubbers of oxidative stress to make sure that oxidative stress doesn't damage the mitochondria. What's melting the snow? It's the infrared radiation from the sun. If the infrared radiation from the sun is powerful enough to melt the snow, it's powerful enough to do whatever it is that it needs to do inside of your body.
Welcome to Apple Finch Pudding, your gateway into the world of science. Today's scientist is Roger Seheult, a professor at Loma Linda University and University of California, Riverside. His work focuses on internal medicine. Welcome, Roger.
Thank you so much, Jeroen. It's great to be here.
Before we start, do you have a fun science fact for our listeners?
A fun science fact. Well, there is some new facts that are coming out that many people may not be aware of, but I work closely with a group in London who's just done some scientific experiments. They're in the field of biology and light, and they've just published a paper in Nature Scientific Reports that shows that certain aspects of the sun can actually penetrate completely through the entire human body.
Okay, that is very interesting. And it's actually also what we want to talk about today, about light, sunlight. So that's perfect. But maybe before we delve into that, in recent years, you have focused a lot of your work on light therapy and photostimulation and stuff, or biostimulation. Why is that? Was there a specific trigger or some event that happened in your life why you got into this research?
Yeah, there was. It was COVID-19. I'm a lung physician, and I'm also working in the critical care and the intensive care unit. So I take care of people that are on ventilators. And as you can imagine, I was very busy about 4 or 5 years ago and had a lot of questions about that and why it seemed like what we could do better. And a couple of things piqued my interest when I started to delve into that experience during the pandemic for me. And it was how we saw that vitamin D was very predictive of how people would do when they came in. But giving vitamin D didn't seem to change the course of what had happened. So I began to believe and started to look more closely at perhaps vitamin D was a marker of something else that was doing a lot of the heavy lifting. And it turned out, I believe it is true, and that is the sun. And so, of course, I do believe, and I think that the data shows that sunlight is very beneficial to the human body outside of vitamin D. I do believe that vitamin D is important, but that's what really led me down the rabbit hole, as it were, looking at the physics and the chemistry of light, which we don't get much of when we talk in terms of medicine. We do know about vitamin D, and I actually had a lot of research in my background on vitamin D. I was a chemistry major and a biology major. But that was one of the things that got me interested. The other thing was oxidative stress and mitochondrial biology. It was, as many of people know who are not even in medicine, the receptor for the SARS-CoV-2 virus was an enzyme in the body, is an enzyme in the body called ACE2. ACE2 is a modulating enzyme of oxidative stress in the cell. And so when it gets knocked out, oxidative stress goes up. And we all have varying amounts of oxidative stress, and that ties in again to the whole light question as well. So those are the two things that really got me interested into that. Because of my YouTube channel, and because of the sort of things that we talked about, I was able to become acquainted with some really leading luminaries in the field of light biology, and we've collaborated together. And I think this really fits in perfectly with your stance here and what you're doing on your podcast. And that is this. One of the things that I found is very important, and what we've discovered in collaboration with other people in different fields of science, is we're all in our little silos of science. We have the biologist in one silo, we have the chemists in another silo, we have the people in medicine in another silo. And we have to do that, because for us to be able to do the research that we need to be able to do, we have to be very fluent and very competent in our areas to be able to understand it. But what I'm finding is that people are making discoveries in different silos, and they're not talking to each other. or people are not recognizing the significance of a discovery in one silo and how it can help in another silo. And what we've just discovered coming together and deciding and looking at this from different aspects, a light engineer, a physicist, an astrophysicist, an ophthalmological biologist, and myself as a medical physician, we've put things together, and we're beginning to understand things in a completely different light.
Yeah, so you really need that interdisciplinarity to have those insights, because a lot of people, when they hear we need sunlight, they think, oh, we need vitamin D, but it's more than just vitamin D. Can you give us a bit more? Because you also said like there is light that goes through the body and stuff like that. So what does that do exactly?
Yeah, so let's get into the physics. So the electromagnetic radiation spectrum from the sun, as many of you know, it sort of approximates a black body radiation, which means that at a certain temperature, there is a distribution of photons that come from the sun that are imbued with different energies, and those energies are directly related to the frequency and how they appear to the human eye and even past the human eye. So we have the infrared spectrum. This is light that has longer wavelength than red light. It has lower energies in general. If you look at, Planck's constant times the frequency. And by the way, these are the majority of the photons coming from the sun. More than 50% of the photons coming from the sun and coming through our atmosphere and hitting the surface of our planet is in the infrared spectrum. Then as you start to get higher in energy, higher in frequency, and shorter in wavelength, you come into the visible spectrum, which is kind of arbitrary because we've labeled that because we can happen to see it with our eyes. But that's, coming up from red, that's red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. And obviously that has higher energy, and that has a big impact on our eyes and in health and things of that nature, mood, circadian rhythm. And then finally, going past that, you go into the ultraviolet spectrum, much more powerful, able to actually break chemical bonds. This is how it's able to, in your skin, turn a derivative of cholesterol into vitamin D, which has many uses. I'm not saying that vitamin D is useless here, but it has uses that are very specific for it, particularly in calcium metabolism, bone metabolism. But there's vitamin D receptors all over the body in white blood cells. And so we probably don't understand all of what vitamin D does. It's not only a vitamin, but a hormone. It's extremely important. And ultraviolet light from the sun is actually helping create that and produce that in your skin. It further gets processed in the liver and the kidney into the active form. And then, of course, we can go off even further down that spectrum. You get ionizing radiation from the sun, which you don't want to be around, like X-rays and things of that nature. But there is a continuum. Now, the light that we utilize from the sun are those three components. There's infrared light, there is visible light, and there's ultraviolet light. We've talked about ultraviolet light. We can talk more about visible light, but it's basically mood, circadian rhythm, and it activates pathways in the back of the retina that send signals to the brain and various aspects of the brain, the perihibennular nucleus when we're talking about mood, the occipital lobe when we're talking about visualization of light, things of that nature. Let's spend a little bit of time talking about this area called infrared light, which we really haven't talked much about. And this is the part that's really exciting. So one of the properties of low wavelength energy is that it can penetrate very deeply into objects. So you know this intuitively when you pull up to a stop sign and someone's next to you in a car playing music. You're typically hearing the low frequency sounds. It's coming through their car into your car, shaking the steering wheel. And it's no different with transverse versus longitudinal waves. Those waves are able to penetrate deeply through. So what Glenn Jeffrey did, he is a professor in ophthalmology at University College London, recently published a paper in Nature Scientific Reports, and he basically took people outside into the sun and was able to measure the spectrum of light coming into the body, and then the measurement of the spectrum of light coming outside, coming through about 30 centimeters of the thorax and then coming through the other side. Now, obviously, it was much lower in intensity, but there was a particular spectrum of light, and it was centered particularly around 700 to 900, but sort of the peak being around the mid 800s. So let's just say 850. He was able to demonstrate that this type of infrared light, which you cannot see in the infrared spectrum, 850 nanometers, is over 100 times more able to penetrate through not only your skin, but also clothing. And he actually demonstrated that in his paper that he published with Bob Fosbury and a number of others in his lab. But he didn't stop there. What he showed, and what I think is really fascinating, and this is where we get into sort of the molecular biology and the metabolism aspect of this, which is fascinating, is he was able to show that that type of light that's penetrating through the human body is really able to touch every single cell in the body, even though it's not illuminating that particularly in its path. This is how we did it. The tissue in the human body that has the highest concentration of mitochondria is the retina. And that's what he studies. He's been studying this for decades. And obviously, he's in the Department of Ophthalmology. So he has a surrogate way of measuring how well the mitochondria is working in the retina, because the cones in the retina, which can detect different colors, red, green, and blue, are highly dependent on energy production by the mitochondria in those cones. And if the mitochondria in those cones are not working very well, there is a problem with color discrimination. He's a very sensitive test that he can use to test color differentiation. And what will happen is, as we get older, the amount of ATP that's produced by those mitochondria can drop anywhere from 40 to 70%. So as those mitochondria start to come back online and produce more energy, the reduction in color discrimination that we get as we get older is reversed, and we actually are better able to detect the differences in colors very subtly. So what he did was he actually had 3 different groups in this trial. He had a LED bank of lights that were illuminating at 850 nanometers, which was sort of that area there that was the highest to being able to go through the body. And he had 3 groups. One where the light was turned off, so that was the standard, that was the control group. The second one was someone who was illuminated both on the head and the body, so everywhere. And then another one where it was just the body. He actually put an aluminum container over the head to absolutely make sure that no light could reach the retina directly. And what he showed in the data was that there was a statistically significant improvement in color discrimination in the group that had both the head and the body illuminated. So clearly showing that this type of light was able to upregulate and increase energy production. That wasn't that new, because they'd actually demonstrated this in previous studies. But what was interesting about this was that when they put the container over the head, they were able to still see, even though the light was not directly hitting the mitochondria, through some sort of a remote way of communicating called the Abscopal effect. It's well actually documented. He was able to show that upregulating mitochondria in the path of the light in one part of the body was actually able to improve the mitochondria output of ATP in other parts of the body that were not directly connected to this light.
Wow, okay, that was super interesting, but also a lot of information. Maybe just to make sure that I get it, we are talking now about infrared light, and it passes through the body. My first question would be, what is the use if it passes through? But you said it activates the mitochondria, and it activates the mitochondria in that way that if it activates those in your abdomen, it also activates those in your eyes, your retina, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Now, the first question I would say, like, we are upregulating our mitochondrial activity.
Yes.
Why do we need to do that? Why do we need to upregulate that activity? And why do we need those mitochondria?
Yeah, so mitochondria are the powerhouses of the cell. You've probably heard that expression before. They're like the batteries. And as we get older, the mitochondria are really central to not only aging, but chronic disease. So if there's well-documented studies that have been looked at, mitochondria is the epicenter of heart disease. It has been shown to be at the center of neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's disease. It's been shown to be the causative agent in kidney disease, in a whole host of chronic diseases. The mitochondria and its inability to produce energy over time is one of those things. And think about the mitochondria as like an engine in your car. The engine in your car makes locomotion. It makes your car drive, right? But one of the intrinsic properties of a internal combustion engine is that it makes heat. And if you don't deal with that heat, it can make the engine more inefficient and it actually can shut it down. So you need to have a cooling system for that engine. And that's very similar to what we believe is going on in the mitochondria. For people who understand the electron transport chain, at the very end of the electron transport chain, there are 4 electrons and 4 protons that need to be handed off to oxygen, which is my favorite molecule as a pulmonologist. It's the reason why we breathe, is because those oxygen molecules are there to accept the 4 electrons. And when they do that, you get a water molecule. It's great. It's safe. It's water, which you can use everywhere in the body. And the most important is that there's no spare electrons floating around. The problem happens is if you only transfer 3 electrons or 2 or 1. In that case, you'll get a hydroxy radical, hydrogen peroxide, or a superoxide molecule, which are very, very reactive and will damage anything that is next to it. Of course, if these are being produced in the mitochondria, what's going to be damaged? It's the mitochondria. Same thing with the engine in the car. If the engine is making heat, it's that very heat that is being produced by the engine that can shut down that engine. And so we have cooling systems in the mitochondria that soak up that oxidative stress. Things like melatonin, which is actually produced in orders of magnitude higher concentration in the mitochondria than it is actually in the pineal gland that we all think about and hear about when we're talking about sleep medicine. A whole host of enzymes like superoxide dismutase, catalase. There's other ones like glutathione. These are all chemicals that are scrubbers of oxidative stress to make sure that oxidative stress doesn't damage the mitochondria. The problem is that when we have chronic disease like diabetes, like high blood pressure, heart disease, these are not only the result of oxidative damage to the mitochondria, they also perpetuate more and more oxidative damage. And one of the biggest ones that we've had a big hit on recently in the last 5 years, of course, we just talked about this in terms of why I got involved, is COVID-19. This is the reason why people who succumbed to COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2, were people with oxidative stress, right? So who are the people that were most at risk for dying in the hospital? I know this well because I saw it with my own eyes. People who are obese, people with diabetes, people with high blood pressure, people with kidney disease. They already had a certain level of oxidative stress, and now COVID was coming and making it worse. How was it doing that? Because when the virus hits the cell, it knocks out the ACE2. So if you want to picture this, you're asking about, your original question is, why is the mitochondria so important? It's extremely important. If you want to picture this in terms of a car engine again, imagine that we're all vehicles traveling on a road. And some of us are healthy and fit, and our engines are running nice and cool. The temperature gauge is way down, nice and low. Some of us are a little overweight or a little bit older. Maybe we've got diabetes or some other chronic disease. And as a result of that, our engines are not running as cool as they should be, and they're running a little bit hot. That temperature gauge is a little bit higher up. It's not in the red, but it's getting close. And then all of us, as we're going down the road, we hit this hill called COVID-19. Now, who's going to make it up that road? Who's going to make it up that hill? It's people who have nice, cool engines. The ones that don't are the ones that are going to overheat on the way up over that hill. And that's exactly what we saw. And so why this became important to me is if infrared light is doing something to upregulate mitochondrial production, which it absolutely has been shown to do with multiple studies, not just in humans, but also in animals. And all of this is conserved, by the way, across species. The mitochondria all behave the same way. If this has actually been shown to be true, what is it doing? Why is it doing it? And can it be used not only as a help for COVID-19, but also for chronic disease as well? And I began to look at actually not only studies on individuals and clinical trials, but also epidemiologically. And the data is there, and it's actually quite astounding.
Maybe also one thing that I'm thinking of, because you said actually everything that causes damage is oxidative stress, right?
Oxidative stress causes a lot of the damage. It's not just oxidative stress, but that is a major portion of it. And it also causes mutations in the DNA, a whole host of problems. Yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, there's a lot of food with on the packaging antioxidants. Is that something that would help, or is that just nonsense?
It could, but again, the problem with a lot of the antioxidants that you take orally, I mean, some of them certainly do have an impact. There's no question about it. Like, for instance, N-acetylcholine or NAC or NAC, as it's known as, that has been shown to show actually in randomized placebo-controlled multi-center trials to reduce the severity of the flu, which also is related to oxidative stress as well as COVID-19. So yeah, there are some benefits, and we can get into those clinical trials. But as I began to look around and I say, well, this is interesting. If this is true, if infrared light can penetrate through the body and have effects, then we should be able to see epidemiologically, we should be able to see an effect on latitude. We should be able to see an effect on sunlight. We should see that this has worked somewhere in the past, and we should see evidence of that.
And did you see those effects?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, we can run through the data. I mean, let's just talk about the history first before we get into the actual published trials. We've known this actually for centuries. And if you look 100 years ago, how we used to take care of patients in Europe, in the United States, across the world, it was extremely important that hospitals had big windows and that people were taken outside regularly. People noticed that people got better faster. Even today, we have studies that show that people who have two beds in a room, the one that's closer to the window is discharged on average faster than the one that is not there. But let's get to some data. So if you may recall, in the autumn of 2020, northern Italy was hit really hard with COVID at the beginning. It was up there in the north aspect of Italy. And that was because there was a lot of people coming in from China. But as it started to spread around and go in a lot of places, this was back in July, as the sun started to drop into the southern hemisphere in the autumn of 2020, what scientists did was they looked to see which factors predicted the surges of COVID-19 in the different countries of Europe. I think it was Dr. Walren who actually who did this and published it. And he looked at humidity, he looked at temperature, and there was absolutely no correlation. But when he looked at latitude, there was a 0.73 R-squared correlation, which showed perfectly that the very first countries to have their surges of COVID-19 were those at the top of Europe. So Finland, Sweden, Norway, and then it moved down the continent. And the very last country to have a spike in their surge in their COVID-19 in the autumn of 2020 was Greece. In fact, when he looked at ultraviolet light as a percentage of what was coming out at the equator, and he set it to about, I think it was 23%, there was a 0.993 correlation. So it was almost like a law of chemistry, like a V or a physics, like V equals IR. That's how specific it was. Another study was published by Richard Weller, dermatologist out of University of Edinburgh, looking at COVID-19 mortality and ultraviolet A radiation, which was a surrogate marker for sunlight. And he looked in the United States in an area where there was no vitamin D being produced at all. This is in the northern part of the United States. And he was able to show that COVID-19 mortality was correlated to the amount of ultraviolet A radiation. The more ultraviolet A radiation, the lower the mortality in those areas. Now, you might say, well, maybe there may be some confounders, and association does not necessarily mean causation. Remember, in the United States, that typically the higher socioeconomic classes generally are in the northern portion of the United States. And yet, it was in the South that we saw, based on UVA and latitude, that we saw the better COVID-19 mortalities. We go to England. They went and now repeated the study in England. They found exactly the same relationship. They found that more ultraviolet A radiation correlated with lower COVID-19 mortality. Now, of course, in England, it's the flip. You have higher socioeconomic classes in the South and lower in the North. The relationship still held. They repeated it again in Italy this time. And you may recall in Italy, I believe the North has a higher socioeconomic class than in the South. Again, exactly the same relationship. It didn't matter if it was one way or the other. The more ultraviolet A radiation there was, the lower the COVID-19 mortality was based on that. And there's a whole host of other diseases, by the way, influenza, multiple sclerosis. In fact, I actually teamed up with Margaret Scutch, who's a geographist at Mexican University, and we were able to show that for all countries where 50% of their population has a BMI of over 25, that if you looked at that, the mortalities in those countries correlated with latitude. So there's a lot of information on this. I could bring up study after study showing this, but for a smart scientist out there who understands this, what you really need to actually pin down causality is a randomized placebo-controlled trial. I'll finish with this study. This was a Brazilian study. They looked at 30 patients with COVID-19 sick enough to be admitted to the hospital, and they randomized them to a jacket that had infrared LED bulbs on the inside of the jacket. And they randomized them to either having the jacket turned on or turned off. Now, it was blinded because this is light that you cannot see, number one. And number two, the irradiance was 2.9 milliwatts per square centimeter, which is very, very, very low. You would not be able to feel the heat from these LED bulbs, which generally are designed not to give off heat anyway. And when they did the randomization of these 30 subjects, 15 in one group, 15 in the other, the 15 that was randomized to the intervention was actually sicker patients. So they had lower oxygen saturations, they had higher sickness scores for COVID. Yet, despite that, in every single endpoint, it was statistically significant with only an N of 30. And they found that they had faster oxygen saturation improvement. They were able to take in bigger breaths, stronger exhalation, stronger inhalation. Their heart rates and their respiratory rate came down to normal faster. In fact, their white blood cells actually improved rather than getting worse in the control group. But the real amazing endpoint of that study was, instead of spending 11.7 days in the hospital as the control group did, the intervention group spent on average only 8 days. So they were able to cut off almost 4 whole days of hospital admission simply by giving them infrared light at, in this case, it was 940 nanometers for 15 minutes a day, just once a day. When I saw that study, that basically, there was no question in my mind.
That's insane. That's really insane.
Yeah.
So based on everything that you're saying, I think sunlight and especially infrared light is extremely important for human health. But are you able to give us some degree of how important it is? For example, we have a lot of diseases that are increasing in frequency. Is it because we are not getting out enough?
I 100% believe that. Let me give you some statistics to sort of frame it in your mind. In 1992, the EPA, which is the Environmental Protection Agency in the United States, conducted a survey, and they found that in 1992, this is before the widespread use of video games, this is before the iPhone, this is before social media, this is before the internet. Okay, 1992. Even at that time, we as Americans, and we're probably worse than the Europeans are, but the Europeans are not too far behind. We spend about 92 to 93% of our time inside. So that means only 7 to 8% of our time do we spend outside. That's pretty low. That's probably much different than our ancestors used to do, working on farms, working outside, and doing these sorts of things. Now, there's a study that showed in the United States that trend has continued to get worse. There's a study that looked at time outside the home, and that has really been dropping consistently. And then when it hit 2020, which is, of course, when the pandemic hit, it just fell off the cliff. And you know why, right? Because the amount of time that we spent out of the home, we were actually told to not go out of the home. We started to learn a lot of behaviors, and a lot of companies sprung up that made it easier for us not to leave our home, like DoorDash, or, I don't know if you have those things there in Europe or not, but you can basically call out and they will deliver the food to your house. You can have Amazon here in the United States. I don't know how it is there in Europe, but you can have packages. Same, right? Yeah. So you can have you don't have to leave your home anymore. You can have all of these things come, and you can sit there and watch screens and play video games. One aspect of this is that we are spending more time in our homes. Now, what is happening to our homes? Here's what's happening in terms of light. Okay, there's only really a few ways that light can come into your home. Either it's produced artificially inside of your home, or it comes in through a window. And unfortunately, I can only speak to what's going on here in the United States, but I'm sure it's not too different. At least I know it's not too different in England. I'm sure it's not too different there in the continent as well. But because of energy issues, because of energy conservation, we have laws in our country, and specifically here where I live in California, that any kind of new buildings that get put in have to have non-incandescent light bulbs. So I'll give you a little bit of a talk about what's happened here in the United States. A couple of years ago, we had a law handed down that regulated light bulbs. And an incandescent light bulb produces about 15 lumens per watt. Now, what is a lumen? A lumen is a measurement of light that is predominantly around the yellow and green area, and it's a very old, archaic way of measuring light. Probably in the 1920s, they came up with this, the way of regulating it. And we made a law in the United States a couple of years ago saying that you can only sell light bulbs in a general sense at your local convenience store if it meets 45 lumens per watt. So what does that essentially mean? Incandescents are out. Yes, you can still get them if they're a specialty bulb or if you have a special chandelier or if it's a 40 watt or 60 watt, but gone are the days where you can get a 100 watt A19 bulb that you screw into a socket in your home, unless you still have that. And so what's there now? LED bulbs. Now, realize that the reason why LED bulbs are so much more energy efficient is because engineers have been able to really narrow the spectrum of the electromagnetic spectrum. So let's back up a little bit. An incandescent bulb is like the sun. It's like a black body radiation type of thing. It gives off in all of the wavelengths. So it's this wide spectrum that covers the visible and well into the infrared. Well, scientists who are in the Department of Energy look at that and they say, look at all that wasted energy. And so what they do is they come up with these light emitting diodes that can be engineered to give off, for every electron that goes in there, it's going to be giving you just visible light. And just to pause there, this is the first time in human history that we have been exposed to light just in the visible spectrum without giving us light in the infrared spectrum. Now, if you think about that from a biology standpoint, again, let's go back to Glenn Jeffrey's work and we look at the cones in the eyes and the rods for that matter. So these are machines in the back of our retina that are specifically designed to take photons of light and to process that into electrochemical transmission of information to the back of the brain. That takes a lot of energy to do that. And the mitochondria there are packed. So they're being asked to make ATP to do this type of work. And in the past, before we had LED lights, there would be infrared coming in there. And as we've already established, that infrared light was going to be helping to maintain the energy production so that you have energy production that's being maintained. And then you're giving it a task to take this visible light and convert it into chemical transmission. Now, what we have is we have visible light that's coming in, but no supporting infrared light whatsoever. Do you see that? That's a major issue. And I'm not, trust me, I'm not the only one that's noticed that. Glenn Jeffries has done work on this. He actually has a paper right now that's in review that is probably going to be published very shortly. And I'll just cut to the chase. Basically, what he was able to show was that there was dramatic improvement in color discrimination when he simply added a 60-watt bulb to someone's LED environment. This is randomized controlled trial stuff. So let's go back to our environment. Like you said, what's going on and why is this important and why are things getting worse? We're inside more often. And the lighting that we're using inside more often is more and more devoid of that infrared light that we are finding that's actually very beneficial. Second aspect is the windows. So I can tell you in California, because I live in a very hot environment, a lot of air conditioning is being used to keep our offices and our homes cool, right? So it's unacceptable to go into a place of business and have it be 80 degrees. Everyone expects that business has to be 72 or 73, no higher than 75 or 76 degrees. If we have really hot days in California, they'll have rolling blackouts. Why? Because everybody has their air conditioner on, and it takes a lot of electricity to cool down the buildings. So one of the ways that they have of mitigating that problem is to make it a law, which is what they've done, that if you are building a home or if you're going to replace your windows, instead of having windows that allow infrared light to come in, which most used to do, they now have something called low E glass. And there's different levels of that. Obviously, if you're living in Canada or you're living in Northern Europe, perhaps, and you want that stuff to come in, then you probably will have infrared light to help warm. In other words, if you're living in a climate where you have to pay more for heating than you do for cooling, then you're probably not going to have laws that require you to have low E glass. But if you're living in a place like I am in Southern California, or you're living in Texas or Arizona or Florida, they're going to be mandating you to be putting in glass that is low E glass so that, again, you're not allowing that infrared light to come in. So think about where we are right now. It's like a perfect storm. We have some evidence to indicate that infrared light, which is more than 50% of the photons from the sun and is able to penetrate through your body and clothes. And by the way, I'm going to leave a little asterisk here, but we can talk a little bit more about the astrophysics of this. We can talk about the photosphere of the sun that actually allows us to have some of those infrared photons. We can talk about the H band and the I bands in the atmosphere that are actually windows of transparency that allow these type of photons to come through the earth. Comes through the earth, comes through our clothes, comes through our body, nourishes our mitochondria. But what have we done? We've eliminated that type of light from our life by going inside, by learning practices that keep us inside, by changing out the light bulbs that give us the infrared light, and putting in new windows that block that infrared light even more. Do you see where we're going with this? It's a perfect storm.
Yeah, it's a big problem.
Yeah.
Okay, wow. Okay, but I think maybe the first and most easy step for a lot of people listening is we need to get outside. But it sounds easy, but it's not always easy in practice.
It's
But
true.
assume we are able to go outside. People will immediately ask, how long should I be outside?
Yep. So this is a good question. And when I ask Glenn Jeffrey about his work on the mitochondria, so let me back up a little bit. There are several reasons why you want to get outside. Fresh air is one of those. Very important. Exercise is another reason. But if you want to get outside for light, and you're getting outside specifically for infrared light, because you also want to get outside for vitamin D as well, right? And those actually have different time requirements depending on the time of the year, right? If it's winter time, the sun is very low, you're not going to be getting a lot of vitamin D producing ultraviolet B radiation when the sun is very low. So you may need to be outside for much longer if you're interested in getting vitamin D. However, the good news is, this is the good news about infrared light. Okay, really good news. Even if you go outside on a cloudy day, even if you go outside and it's rainy, even if you go outside and you're worried about skin damage because you don't like the ultraviolet light, again, long wavelength radiation. When I talk about that, I'm talking about infrared light from the sun is able to penetrate even when the sun is very low in the sky. It's able to penetrate through that atmosphere because it penetrates very well. If you have a broad rimmed hat on and you have clothes on, it's able to penetrate through those clothes. It's able to penetrate through. So what I'm saying here is that it doesn't matter the environment. If you're talking about infrared, you go outside. Your question, though, is how long do I need to spend? And when I talk to Glenn Jeffrey, when he's looked at bees, when he's looked at flies, when he's looked at humans, the mitochondria all do the same thing. After about 15 or 20 minutes, you're going to get most of that benefit in terms of infrared light. We talked about that study from Brazil where they looked at COVID patients, 15 in each cohort. Again, how long did they give them infrared light for? 15 minutes a day. And that made such a huge difference. So the good news is that you don't have to go outside for very long, but you have to go outside. So getting outside for 15, 20 minutes more than you are right now is beneficial. Let's talk real quickly here. Is it possible to get enough infrared light even right now? We're talking in late November. What about in wintertime when the sun comes up for a few hours and goes back down? Is it even worth going outside? Think about this. What is one of the biggest dangers of driving after a snowstorm and it freezes at night? Everyone knows it's black ice. How do you get black ice? This is how you get black ice. You have snow that is there, and the sun comes up in the day and it melts that snow into water. And then as the sun goes down and the temperature drops, it freezes. That's how you get black ice. Question: what's melting the snow? It's the infrared radiation from the sun. If the infrared radiation from the sun is powerful enough to melt the snow, it's powerful enough to do whatever it is that it needs to do inside of your body. I'll give you an example. I live in Southern California again, but I live about a mile up. So I get the four seasons. We get the leaves that fall. I get snow, believe it or not. And I remember distinctly one day being outside and there was quite a bit of snowpack on the roof. And the sun, as it was going down, was hitting that snow on the roof, and I could see it dripping. And the temperature, was about maybe in the 30s or 40s, but it was dripping. It was melting. As soon as the sun went down and it became dark or twilight and the sun was no longer directly hitting the snow, the melting stopped. The melting had nothing to do really with the ambient temperature. It was the fact that it was being hit with infrared photons. And so if it's powerful enough to melt snow, it's powerful enough to do what it needs to do in the body, even in the dead of winter.
Okay, so is it safe to assume once you see light from the sun, then it's okay to be outside, then you have the benefits from infrared light?
Absolutely. By the way, I would not recommend looking directly at the sun. I know you're not saying that, but it made me remind myself of that. So don't look directly at the sun because that can cause problems with the retina. I know you're not saying that. I don't want anyone to think that I'm saying that either. Yeah.
No, but it's good that you mention it. So thank you for that.
Yeah.
Maybe also one of the problems that we're having in society in general, and I think a lot of listeners of this podcast have that problem as well. We have a lot of knowledge workers. So those are most of the time inside.
Yep.
How can they fix this? Because they often don't have the option to go outside, or it's not that easy. Should they have, for example, infrared lights or maybe infrared heating or stuff like that?
I think the best thing is to actually get sunlight, and I know the problem because I'm in the same situation. I typically, when I work in the hospital, I have to work from 7 o'clock in the morning to 7 o'clock in the evening, and at this time of year, you are getting up before the sun is getting up. You're in your car, you drive to work, you park in your structure, you go to your office, and then when you're done, the sun is long gone. It's already set, and so you can literally go weeks without seeing the sun. So I really make it a point that when I have a break at work, that's when I try to get outside and try to get as much sun as possible. There was a study that was done in Sweden, published in 2016, looking at about 30,000 Swedish women that were followed for 20 years. And they asked them, how much time do they spend in the sun? And they were able to break them into three groups: those that avoided the sun, those that had moderate sun exposure, and those that avidly went out into the sun, any chance that they had. And they found that those that went out avidly into the sun had the lowest all-cause mortality, lowest cardiovascular mortality, and had the lowest cancer mortality and non-cardiovascular, non-cancer mortality. This study was repeated again just last year, actually. Richard Weller, UK Biobank, 10 times the amount of people, both men and women, exactly the same findings. No statistical significant increase in melanoma deaths as a result of that increased sun exposure. And here's the key point in that Sweden study. Women who went out most avidly and smoked had the same mortality as those women that avoided the sun and did not smoke. And I don't bring that up to encourage smoking, but what I do say is this. In the United States, when people want to go, quote unquote, on a smoking break, they're told to go outside. And so we've built into that sort of culture that people can go outside for 15 minutes for a break. I think it would be a wonderful idea if people were to get outside more often, even during the day when they're on a break, and maybe eat outside or have an area where they work, where there's a solarium or some sort of a sunroom that allows that light to come in that's not blocked by infrared light.
Okay. Yeah, no, I totally agree. Going outside is the best solution. But if someone says, Roger, I'm sorry, but I really can't. It's not possible for me. Is there something they can do inside?
Yes. So basically, this is Glenn Jeffrey's work again, that he has not yet been published, but it is being peer reviewed and is probably going to be published very shortly. And that's where he took a regular 60-watt incandescent bulb that you could probably still get, and screw it into a desk lamp. And he did this in a randomized fashion where he had 22 subjects and he measured their ability to see, so color perception. And then he, at random, put these lamps on the desks. This was in an office at UCL in London, and he measured these people in a random way with the lights. Some of the lights turned on, some of the lights turned off, and he was able to show very robustly, even probably actually even better than the 850 LED lamp that I talked about at the very beginning, where he did it with those 3 arms. Here, when he used incandescent bulbs, there was actually a more robust improvement than there was with the 850. So think about that. The question is should I get a red light or infrared light? And what Glenn Jeffrey is finding is that a incandescent light source that has a broad spectrum of many different wavelengths seems to work more robustly than a monochromatic, or one color, if you will, infrared light that's shining on the body. I think, and we can get into the physics, the quantum physics of this. We're actually looking at this. This is what we're looking at right now to figure out exactly what is light doing at the level of the mitochondria. And it may be that these electron transfers in the electron transport chain, there's a whole science behind this. If you want to look this up, you can look at Marcus, who won the Rudolf Marcus, who won the Nobel Prize in Caltech, on looking, this is back in 1992, looking at the physics of electron transfer. There are certain requirements that are necessary in these enzymatic electron transfers. And what can happen is that infrared light can actually reduce the activation energy of those equations in a way that the transfer of electrons happen faster than they would have if that red light wasn't there. Now, it may be that it's not exactly one wavelength that's doing it, but because there are many electron transfers happening in the mitochondria, that it may take a cacophony of different wavelengths that is only represented in something like the sun. Or if you wanted to make it artificial, an incandescent bulb. So yes, I think based on that research that is going to be published, that was a regular everyday work environment where people could come and go from their desk. And the simple addition of a 60-watt bulb during the day in an LED environment had demonstrably benefits on the mitochondria and the retina. I can only imagine what that might have had on the rest of the body's mitochondria.
In terms of health, do you then think we should move away from LED and back to incandescent bulbs?
This is a really good question. I think probably that would be a huge undertaking, since that we have spent a huge amount of dollars investing in the technology of making LED bulbs. We would definitely want to make sure that this information is solidified and the studies have been done. In my own personal opinion, I believe yes. But at the same time, I really do think that one of the best things to do is to just get outside. Because you can't always regulate the type of things that you run into when you're inside of a building, right? You can talk about what happens or do something about what happens inside your own building or your own home, right? But you can't change what's happening in your supermarket, or what's happening at the bank, or what's happening here or there, or at the hospital that you happen to be in. That's a whole nother issue, by the way. I really love to get my patients outside, and I'm actually working on that. But you can go outside and spend more time outside. And what we're finding, this is another study. This is not Glenn Jeffrey's group. This is another group. And this kind of nails home this whole idea about getting outside and how important it is. So they did a very similar experiment to what Glenn Jeffrey did, but instead of using an incandescent bulb, they used a red light or an infrared light that was at their desk. So very similar experiment design, but instead of using a polychromatic incandescent bulb, they used a monochromatic light. And they found, instead of looking at eye endpoints, whether or not they could see colors, what they did was they checked general feeling of wellness with a score that was validated, how they felt, and things of that nature. There was a statistically significant benefit with the addition of these panels at their desks, but only in the wintertime. Only in the wintertime. And so what does that make me think? I immediately think, these people are getting enough light outside in the summertime that this little red light isn't really adding much. But when you are in the wintertime and you're getting no outside light at all, because when you do go outside, the sun is gone. Now there's such a deficiency of infrared light. Now these things can make the difference. And so what that tells me is that if we simply went outside more often and got more natural light, you wouldn't necessarily need these things that are red lights this and red light that. Kind of makes me think about a situation that we had 300 years ago in the British Navy. If you might recall, people were dying of scurvy. And that's because when they used to take food along on these long journeys, they had to process it and they had to preserve it. And the preserving process of bringing food along completely eliminated the vitamin C in that food. So people were eating food that was very deficient in vitamin C, and then soon they became vitamin C deficient, and they had no idea that this was the case, and they were getting scurvy. People had bleeding gums. They were dying. And then somebody figured this out. I don't know how they actually discovered this, but they realized that it was a vitamin C deficiency, and that was in the lime juice or the lemons. And that's why British sailors were known as limeys, because the British Navy understood this. So what happened was is that when they gave them a ration of lime juice, they were able to completely eliminate the negative effects of the vitamin C deficiency and scurvy. And it seems almost like magical thinking. Imagine the incredulity of the British sailors at that time, looking at people saying, you just have to drink this every day and you will not have scurvy. And realize that if they were to have a balanced diet of vitamin C, they would never have needed the lime juice, right? And so I guess what I'm saying is that we're seeing today the rise of red light this and infrared light that. And I'm trying to think, have we been deficient our whole lives of red light? I don't think so. I think this is a recent situation as a result of the fact that we're not getting enough natural light. And as Bob Fosbury, who's one of those scientists there at UCL, says, and we coined this term, he says, the lack of natural sunlight is the scurvy of the 21st century. And that's why we're seeing all of the rise of these lights, this and light that can manipulate, because we're having such a severe deficiency. If we were to go outside and get plenty of sunlight, my personal opinion is that much of the efficacy of these red lights would probably not be as high as they are now.
Wow. Okay. And that's also a really nice analogy. And maybe you also mentioned it's actually also part of a timing effect. Like the effect is bigger in winter because we have less light. You also have a timing difference maybe on a smaller scale. For example, some people might not be able to go outside enough in the week, but they might be able to get outside in the weekend. Does that help?
They are looking to see how long these effects are. Now, in the study in the LED lab with the incandescent bulbs that Glenn Jeffrey did, interestingly, after they had the incandescent bulbs there for 2 weeks, he took the incandescent bulbs away and then measured to see if the effects would last and how long it would last. He measured it at 2 weeks and it was there. 2 weeks later, without the incandescent bulbs, with them gone, 2 weeks later, it was still there. 4 weeks later, it was still there. 6 weeks later, it was still there. So I do think that certain aspects of this are longer lasting. I'll give you another study to make you think about how quickly this can actually work. There was a study that was done in Oxford University and the University of Leiden. They collaborated together where they took 10,000 subjects and they drew their blood and they measured insulin sensitivity and triglycerides. Okay, these are all metabolic end products. And they were able to show, when they looked at the weather reports in the previous 7 days for all of those people that had their blood drawn all throughout the year, that the more sun there was in the forecast or the actual report, by the hour, the better the insulin sensitivity was and the lower the triglycerides were. So that's sunlight working within 7 days that was able to see a difference at the end of 7 days. So I do believe that daily sunlight is beneficial. I think the more you get, the better it is. That study from Brazil with COVID is one of those, obviously. But at the same time, Glenn Jeffrey's work seems to me to indicate that there are longer term effects. It could very well be that the infrared light is revving up the engine, and that is causing stimulation of protein synthesis. And there are now more FTPases and there's more electron transport proteins that have been manufactured at the very beginning when there was sunlight, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it does actually. But okay, so the lack of infrared light can be one of the causes of some diseases. Can you mention some of those diseases? And maybe also you mentioned you want to get your patients outside. How is that working and does that help or not?
Yeah, I think this affects just about every organ disease. Let me give you some hard data. There was a study that was done at Harvard, actually at the Harvard Kennedy School, and they looked at influenza. This is something that affects all of us every year, either ourselves or people that we know. And the problem with looking at influenza, and let's just let's sort of back up a little bit. If you were to look at every single natural cause of death, okay, this is going to be mind-blowing what I'm about to tell you, but I want you to actually confirm it. If you look at every single natural cause of death and it's plotted out throughout the entire year, you will see a very specific pattern. You will see that all of the natural causes of death, whether it's heart disease, cancer, kidney disease, influenza, pneumonia, etc., they all go up together and they all come down together. And they all go up and peak 1 to 3 weeks after the shortest day of the year. And they all go back down again, and they are all at their lowest 1 to 3 weeks after the longest day of the year. So for us in the Northern Hemisphere, that's going to be December, January. Now, you may say, well, it's because, at least here in the United States, we have Thanksgiving, people get together, they swap back and forth, and they cause people to become infected. Then we have Christmas time, and then we have New Year's. So, and certainly in Europe, you've got Christmas and New Year's as well. And this is probably the reason why it goes around. Here's the thing that's really interesting about that. The Australians celebrate Christmas and New Year's with just as much fervor as we do here in the Northern Hemisphere. And they have absolutely no influenza whatsoever. And why is that? Because it's summertime in Australia at that time. They have the longest days of the year. So it's clear to me that it's the sun that is demonstrating this effect on all diseases, not just infectious diseases, but non-infectious diseases. But you may say, okay, well, what about cold weather? Maybe it's cold temperature. People tend to be driven inside, and that's the reason why that's the case. Well, interestingly, in 2009, we had something called the H1N1 pandemic. This is something that went around the world. And what was very interesting about this particular pandemic in 2009, it was our influenza pandemic for that year. It happened in April. It came very early. And so for the first time, we were able to bifurcate or separate out this idea of influenza being in a cold season to see whether or not what were the things that affected that. And so this is what Harvard set out to do. They actually looked at solar radiation data. It was the Harvard Kennedy School. They looked at CDC flu index, and they looked at CDC radiation data. And what they were able to show, based on this particular year mostly, but also other years as well, was that it wasn't temperature that affected how much the flu went. It was actually sunlight. And they even said, and I'll quote what their conclusion was, quote, they said, "We find that sunlight strongly protects against getting influenza." So that's just one aspect. We know that influenza goes up at the same time of year that every other disease goes up. In fact, during the flu season, we have a larger increase in cardiac deaths than we have totally with flu deaths in the United States. Just look at your country's data. I'm sure they publish this, and I will be absolutely sure that that's exactly what you're going to find is these things go up. But it's not just all of those things that I talked about. It's, as I mentioned, multiple sclerosis. It's all of these diseases. If you ask any healthcare worker, they'll tell you that the busiest time of year is in December and January if they're working in the Northern Hemisphere. If they're working in the Southern Hemisphere, it's in July or June. Now, what about the equator? Singapore, which is only 80 miles from the equator. It's interesting. The sun never moves far enough away from Singapore for there to actually be a season where you're having deficiency. And so if you look at the flu season in Singapore, there is no flu season. It just kind of jumps around. There's no like peak and then trough that we normally see in the other countries that are further away from the equator. So it really affects all. And there was recently a paper that was just published this year. And what they did was they took the same kind of infrared light that they used on the COVID patients, but in this case, they did it on all of the patients in the ICU. It didn't matter if they were there because they had sepsis from an infection. It didn't matter if they were there from a post-operative surgery that they had, like a knee replacement or a gallbladder or something else. In other words, all of the patients in the ICU, no matter what the diseases that they had, they all got this infrared therapy. And what do they find? This was published, randomized controlled trial, triple sham, double blinded, all of that. What they found was that there was a 30% reduction in the length of stay in the intensive care unit. And when the patients left the intensive care unit, many times these patients are so debilitated and they have such a lack of strength that they need to go and get rehabilitation at a facility before they can actually go home. What was interesting is that these patients that got infrared light, actually, instead of getting weaker, they are actually stronger than those that did not get the infrared light. So I'm really looking to bringing that type of light into the environment. There's at least, I could probably name off 25 different studies that I've actually collected that have looked at this idea of light in the hospital, in the intensive care setting, in the acute care setting. And so now what I do is I try to get my patients, if we don't have those type of lights that we have now in there, because those have to be approved, they have to be making sure that there's no, that they're medical grade. The easiest thing for me to do is, if they're able to, is to wheel them outside into a wheelchair and have them do that about 20 to 30 minutes every day. But the data is there, and I think regardless of which disease we're talking about, there's going to be a benefit on the patient.
That really is, like you announced it, it is mind-blowing.
Yeah.
But that also makes me think of like old people don't get out as much sometimes because it's like they're not that mobile, or sometimes they just don't want to. Does it worsen the aging process?
I absolutely believe it does. I mean, when we first had COVID, when COVID first hit us in Southern California, the very first patients that filled up our ICU were all the nursing home patients, all of them. Literally cleaned out the nursing homes, almost admitted the entire population of the nursing homes. They were the very first ones. And let's face it, these are the ones that are lucky that they come down for dinner. Like, they'll come down once a day out of their room, and these rooms are dark. The windows are not open. They lose all sort of circadian rhythm. There's multiple disasters that are occurring here. If we would just get these people outside every day in the sunlight, especially in the morning, we would see an improvement in their ability to be awake. We would see a decrease in their dementia. We would see an improvement in their ability to sleep at night. And I believe a much better immune system. So I think the lowest hanging fruit, if you want to really protect somebody, are these people that are immunocompromised, that are sedentary, that are in nursing homes, and they never get a chance to simply just go outside. Absolutely.
And would it also have an effect on longevity in general?
Well, I think it would, but I don't have hard data that shows that. There's a couple of anecdotal stories. I know of a nursing home manager that gave all of his patients, vitamin D, like all of them were doing, but he went the extra step and made sure that every single one of them got outside into the sunlight during the COVID pandemic. And not a single one of them was, if they did get sick, not a single one of them were sick enough to actually go to the hospital. Again, that's not a study, that's just anecdotal, but it's certainly is believable based on the data that we've talked about.
It's a very strong anecdote, at least.
Yeah.
Do you think that's also one of the things that happens during our lifetime? For example, when we're children, our parents tell us to go play outside. Once we're adults, we more or less stay inside to work or to do chores or whatever. Is that why children might sometimes be healthier than adults?
It's certainly mind provoking that could be the case. We definitely have evidence that as you get older, oxidative damage does increase. Whether that's because of sunlight or not, we don't have that kind of data. When you meet people whose jobs are that they actually are outside, there's a lot of people who work in the fields. There's a lot of people who are outside fixing things because of the nature of their work. You might notice that they're able to eat all sorts of things and not get sick. Again, that's anecdotal. And if you look at populations and you look at studies that have done this, there's clearly a relationship there. And again, the data on the randomized controlled trial data that we've seen, not only with just sunlight, but also infrared light, is pretty astounding.
Roger, this is amazingly interesting, but we're running out of time. I feel like I could talk to you for hours, but I'll be mindful of your time. So before we close, do you have a take-home message for our listeners?
It's interesting when I talk about this story and people come tell me about their anecdotal stories. And there's one story that I think is worth mentioning briefly, and to show how powerful this can really be. There was a 15-year-old boy, this mom told me about, her son, who was diagnosed with lymphoma and had to be placed on chemo. And the chemo caused him to be very immunocompromised. And he developed a very severe fungal infection and was in the hospital, so severe, in fact, that despite very powerful antibiotics and antifungals that he was getting, they had to remove his left lung. And shortly after that, his right lung began to get worse, completely awake, alert, got to the point where there was really nothing else the team could do. And they gave him about 2 days to live because he was rapidly decompensating. This was at a hospital. I actually got the medical records. I reviewed them myself. I looked at the CT scans and I looked at see what the team was writing. And this is all confirmed. So when they approached him, they said, "Look, there's nothing else we can do. What do you want to do?" And not knowing that he would get better if he were to go outside, or thinking that was even a possibility, he just said, "I want to go outside. I've been inside for 6 weeks in this hospital, and I just want to get outside." So they moved heaven and earth, that staff. They got him into a mobile chair. They had to bring a lot of machines with him, drips. He was on a breathing device called a BiPAP, and he was on drips and medicines like antifungals. They continued all of it, but they got him outside. And before he went outside, they told him, "You have about 2 days to live." He had high fevers, high white blood cell counts that was fighting this infection. And I think you probably know the way the story's going to go. He went outside and he was in the sun for a good 3, 4 hours, 5 hours. Went back in, came back out the next day, white blood cell improving, fever gone. Spent another 3 or 4 hours outside. Next day, the next day, the next day, started to get better, actually came off of his BiPAP, oxygen requirements improving, doctors scratching their heads, not knowing exactly what was going on, but they were very hopeful, and they decided to get another CAT scan to see what was happening. And if you were to see the CAT scan, it would be absolutely just unbelievable. In fact, the mom said that when they brought up the scans after he had gone outside for about 5 or 6 days, there was like a gasp in the room, because basically the infiltration of the remaining lung, the remaining right lung, had almost completely disappeared. And they had changed nothing. They gave him the same antibiotics. The only thing differently that they had done was taken this boy outside. I can tell you this boy is alive today. He completely recovered from that infection. He still only has one lung, of course, but he's doing well. And this was back in 2024. This was 2 years ago that this happened. It captures my imagination about, really, we know theoretically how important this is. We have some data albeit small n, small subjects, but very statistically significant outcomes. I it's a it's an amazing thing to think about how really powerful sunlight could really be in our lives if we took it seriously and actually got outside instead of avoiding it. I'll finish with this. I thought maybe this was something new, that this was something that we're discovering. But if you excuse the expression, there's actually a Bible text that says there's nothing new under the sun, and that's actually a really important text here because we're talking about the sun, and it was coming from supposedly the wisest man who ever lived. It was Solomon. And if you go back and look about 100 years, actually 150 years ago, more than 150 years ago, there was a lady. Her name was Florence Nightingale. She's considered by many to be the founder of modern nursing. And she was born to a couple of parents that were very well-to-do. They did not want her to go into nursing. Nursing at that time was not a profession that was very well looked upon. But she was named Florence because she was born in Florence, Italy. And this is where the Crimean War was occurring, and the British were taking care of their troops. And she really, to make a long story short, she really cleaned up how they took care of patients. And it was really, even though her parents did not want her to do this, against her parents' will, she went into nursing. She cleaned up that whole aspect of taking care of these soldiers. She talked about getting fresh air and sunlight. And she actually said this. She said, look, there's nothing more that I can see that's so beneficial than these things. Number one, fresh air. Number two, sunlight, not just daylight, but actual sunlight. And I got to tell you, Florence Nightingale did not have all of the scientific accoutrements that we have today. She did not have an echocardiogram. She did not have a chest x-ray. She did not have labs. She didn't have all of those things that we have. But what she did have was the power of her observation, because she was there at the patient's bedside. She was known as the lady with the lamp. And with her own eyes, she could see the beneficial effects that these natural things of just getting outside and getting sunlight could have on the human body. And I think sometimes we can be trapped in our understanding of technology. Sometimes we just got to sort of think about things in a logical way and look at the evidence. And I think if you look at the evidence clearly, there's no study that's perfect, but if you look at the evidence clearly, you'll come to the same conclusion that if we have chronic disease in our lives, if we have diabetes, if we have hypertension, not saying that it's going to treat everything, not saying that nothing bad could go wrong, but if you want to have a fight with chronic disease, you need to look at it in the eye and say, let's take this fight outside.
Okay, that's a great endpoint. Now, to be honest, I've always known that going outside is important. I think most people do, but you are the very first person who is able to convince me of the real importance of going outside. And I think it's important for a lot of people that really don't know about the science that you're just talking about. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
This was Apple Finch Pudding. I want to thank Roger Schwelt for the information. Let's meet again for the next episode of Apple Finch Pudding.